Alright, YouTube, it's time to talk about Meg Hansen here in Vermont, as well as our Governor Phil Scott and Bill S-79, which I believe has now passed the House and is up for Senate consideration. The bill is essentially Sanctuary State Vermont, the bill. It's been proposed by people allied with Phil Scott as well as the Democrats here, which have a supermajority. It's not like Phil Scott could reasonably sit in its way, but he could stand on principle. And it's got some people upset because Phil Scott is a Republican. He was elected by people who largely, most of his constituents, the roughly, maybe 40% of the Vermont population that identifies as, conservative slash Republican slash something other than liberal Democrats. That's the majority of his constituency. He didn't win with, 80% of the vote. It's not like most of the people who voted for him were liberal Democrats. A large proportion of his backers do not like the idea of Vermont, specifically this bill, withholds at the state level. It commands state agencies not to give out personal information to federal agencies, and part of that is national origin. I guess the idea is to stand in the way of ICE and similar groups. My feelings are extremely split on this, because the libertarian and states' rights part of me says there's no reason why the government needs to collect all this data on U.S. citizens. And it's essentially, in a way, it's a states' rights issue. It's national origin be damned as far as this. This is also talking about sexual orientation, people's age, and so forth, and other records about them. I'm not so sure that that stuff needs to be collected at all to have a polite society. I'm uncomfortable with the federal government maintaining such extensive databases on U.S. citizens. It ties right into the surveillance issue. But here's the problem. The problem is twofold. The first problem is that Phil Scott and the Democrats, that apparently he's now a Democrat, he should switch party affiliation and be honest with people. The first problem is that this is, while the bill is well-intentioned, and while the bill fundamentally is a good idea as far as standing in the way of federal overreach, essentially, again, a bunch of liberals are now the states' rights party at this point. While it's good, the clear purpose of the bill is to stand in the way of immigration enforcement, to turn Vermont into a sanctuary state. I think that comes attendant with its own problems when it passes, as it will. When it's passed through, it's going to cause some problems in the state. Specifically, it's going to cause the problem of people who are illegally in this country will come to Vermont. It's cold, and it's not a job-friendly state, so I don't know how many people will actually take advantage of the fact that they can sort of shelter in place here through the Trump administration, at least as long as apparently Phil Scott remains the Democratic at this point governor of the state. But I think it will be a problem. At least on a limited basis, it will encourage people. There are illegal immigrants, for instance, in New York City, in Boston. Maybe they decide that those cities aren't going to protect them enough because the states are at odds with the city policies, and they'll end up coming to Vermont. Again, I'm not so sure that this is going to be a major problem when we've got a housing shortage in this state. We've got a shortage of money in this state. It would be very difficult to convince, I think, even fairly liberal Phil Scott to free up more money that we don't have for taking care of illegal immigrants, beyond maybe the basis of hiring them a lawyer to spar with ICE or something like that. It's very cold and bleak here most of the year. It's not exactly the climate that people from Honduras or Guatemala are used to, and there's no jobs for them. And there's a decreasing amount of welfare. Phil Scott is actually, one thing he has pledged himself to is sort of rescinding that welfare state mentality that we've had for decades here in Vermont. If that goes away, this probably becomes less of a problem. But the big problem here is that he and his allies apparently tried to put weight on a sort of activist, conservative activist and journalist named Meg Hansen in this state. This was reported by Vermont Watchdog. She received apparently an email or a text from some of the staffers there asking her not to report on this bill, asking her not to use her journalistic chops. She maintains blogs and so forth within state and within region, asking her not to cry out against the fact that one of her fellow Republicans, she's a conservative Republican, that one of her fellow Republicans, Phil Scott, the governor of our state, is actually in support of the idea of de facto state-level amnesty for people who are illegally here. They actually tried to put weight on her and harass her into silence. And unfortunately for them, she decided, oh, I'm not going to be silent. I'm going to go to these other groups and tell them that specifically the governor's office is trying to silence me. So Phil Scott, supposedly he's a Republican who was elected to stave off Sue Minter, who is extreme far left on the gun issue. That's why she fundamentally lost. She would have won if she hadn't talked about guns. She would have become our governor if she hadn't talked about the guns issue. I don't know what possessed her. It's like the worst idea that you could have. Liberal as Vermont may be, we're not in favor of gun control in this state. We're trying to get rid of the one meaningful piece of gun control we have, which is a suppressor ban, is something that we've been trying to get rid of now for a few years. We have no real gun control in the state of Vermont because we have no gun crime to justify it. This isn't New York City. This isn't Bloomberg land. This isn't, the middle of California filled with Crips and Bloods and cartel La Raza and all this stuff. This is Vermont. We're talking about northern New England. Yeah, we're on an international border. It's the Canadian border. People aren't worried about a bunch of Canadian cartels coming down, generally speaking. It just doesn't happen. Like robbing our maple syrup at gunpoint. Although there was one maple syrup heist, and I have my suspicions about what country was involved there. You better be returning our maple syrup or you're in deep trouble. It's superior to the stuff they have in Canada anyway. Vermont maple syrup is like #1. Canada is like #2, and then New Hampshire's pretty good. Yeah, it's sort of like, Vermont's twin. Literally the twin state situation. Or tri-state area if you count Maine. New England at large. All these different terms that people outside of New England know nothing about. Again, we call people from like the New York City area, we call them flatlanders. It's pretty funny. Or people from Connecticut. Sorry, Connecticut, but you're not exactly geographically part of New England. Hate to burst your bubble, the nanny state bubble. As far as the governor's office, though, attempting to silence a conservative critic, do we need any more evidence that he's not really a Republican? He has an R after his name. He runs as a Republican, but so far everything that he's done has been essentially bowing down to the Democratic Party. Now, don't blame me. I voted for Listman. I voted for Phil Scott in the general because he got the nomination. I was concerned that Sue Minter was going to drive up the crime rate here by trying to ban firearms. But I thought Listman was the better potential Republican candidate. Apparently the other Republicans, some so-called in the state of Vermont, decided that was a bad idea, decided to put in Phil Scott. I don't think he'll win re-election, by the way. Nope. No, I don't. I think he's pissed off most of his constituents already. The one thing that he's pledging himself to, the one area in which the Republicans in this state are working with the Democrats, and it's actually a good thing, is, let's legalize marijuana and stop, the drug war stuff, at least at the state level. It'll save us a lot of money, probably drive the crime rate down. You get more addiction treatment centers open instead of putting people in prison. Yeah, probably help solve the opiate epidemic in the state. It'd be a good thing for us. I'm not going to fault him for that. And I have to support Phil Scott on this bill to the extent that it's standing in the way of the federal government's abusive overreach. But national origin should not have been included on this list. If Vermont becomes a sanctuary state, then dark times will be upon us. We're going to get sued by the federal government, by the Trump administration, into heavy debt and into oblivion, and become a laughingstock. This is a projection of Mayor Christopher Loris' plan for this city of Rutland, for which he got booted out overwhelmingly. He got 1/3 of the votes, and he probably would have won if it weren't for that one issue of transparency. When Phil Scott says we're going to become a sanctuary state, all the hippies and nerds up in Burlington love him for it. And they'll vote for him again just because of that. But most of his constituents didn't vote for him to do those things. And it's going to become more unpopular when people realize that the governor's office is trying to silence critics. That's the problem. He's making the same mistake Loris made. The mistake isn't suggesting that Vermont should shelter illegal immigrants any more than the situation here in Rutland before with Loris was fundamentally about refugee influx. That wasn't the central issue. It was only the central issue because of lack of transparency. Otherwise, it wouldn't have become a big issue. Loris got booted out because he seemed unconcerned with what his constituents did or did not want, didn't want to conduct the town meeting, didn't want to take questions, didn't want to put it before a vote, and Phil Scott is making the same mistake. If he claims that he's, oh, I'm a Republican, I'm a conservative, I'm this, that, and the other thing, wouldn't you want that movement to be seen at least as honest and transparent enough to pretend that it cares about the people of the state? Instead, you decide to put weight on the one person from the conservative movement, rare breed in Vermont anyway, who's going to report negatively on the bill and its possible impact on our state finances. It's a terrible idea. It makes Phil Scott look dishonest. Now, I voted for the dude, so I get to complain about it when he does things that are fucking stupid. And that's what this is. The bill itself is fine, okay, but why don't you sit there and defend it? Instead of trying to silence your critics, why don't you come out and do what Loris didn't do and visibly defend it, explain your reasoning for adding national origin to the bill before ramming it through and then trying to keep all your critics silent? Well, trying to silence people doesn't, it's called the Streisand effect. It's not going to work. That's not the way the world works anymore. We have the internet now. It's not like some reporter has to write down the notes on paper and then go back to some syndicated local TV channel or to their, little radio center or something to broadcast the message about what Phil Scott is doing. We have the internet now. She can just slap it on a blog. She can slap it on YouTube. She can slap it on a Facebook page, and people are going to spread that material around. It's impossible to silence people anymore. It's impossible. The government hasn't learned this yet at many levels. The Obama administration didn't understand it. Even the Trump administration appears only to half comprehend it. It's a step in the right direction, but it's still not fully there. Much less, apparently, people like Loris and Phil Scott. And that's their problem. People in Vermont want transparency and openness and things like that. It's not about the fundamental issue of do we or do we not become a sanctuary state. And it's going to lead to the same electoral result, probably in the next election, that happened with Loris. He'll get kicked out, not because specifically the bill was wildly unpopular. Hell, the majority of the state might support it. But he's going to look dishonest by trying to muzzle people directly through his staff, muzzle people who would criticize it to, a relatively large audience. And then, I mean, if this hadn't happened, I wouldn't be making a video on the subject, speaking to the people of Vermont, to, over 100,000 subscribers. Is Phil Scott aware of how much of a web presence some of us really do have? Apparently he's not. He thinks he's still living in, 50s or 60s Vermont, where some people they still walk up and down the dirt road and use a Stanley steamer or something like that. Like we're underdeveloped, like the Northeast Kingdom hasn't gotten broadband yet still. Or something like that. It's not the way that Vermont works. Yeah, we can be rustic, as Laura Ingraham would say. Yeah, I can be rustic and peaceful, the leaves changing color, maple syrup and cows, moo moo, and stuff like that. That's great. We also have the internet. It's a lot bigger than the state of Vermont. So it's not going to work. Phil Scott really made a mistake here. The bill, you can debate all day over whether it's a good idea to add national origin. And people who don't like immigration or refugees, they'll say, no, it's not a good idea. And people who don't have a problem with these, they'll say, yeah, it's an okay idea. And people like me will be conflicted because essentially it's like states' rights and a libertarian issue. But at the same time, he's then attempting to silence his critics on this token. That's the problem. It's Loris 2.0. It's like the mayor of Rutland has now become the governor of Vermont. What's next? What next figure is going to try to do this and end up ending their own career by virtue of doing so? It's going to become a problem. That's about all. Peace out.